This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. 3 U.S. firefighters have died in Australia. Their plane carrying fire retardant went down in the mountains south of Canberra, the Australian capital, on Thursday. The New York Times reports nearly 200 American fire personnel have been deployed to Australia since December to help fight the bushfires that have raged there since October. An estimated 25 million acres have burned. Coming up, we talk with a Yale researcher about how habitat loss will impact hundreds of millions of animals on the continent. First, what caused the devastating fires in Australia? Scientists say climate change has exacerbated the fire season. And why is Australia one of the most fire-prone continents on Earth? To help answer that question and more, joining me by phone is Rebecca Buchholz, project scientist with the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Hi, Lucy. Thanks for having me on the show.
Before we talk about your work as a scientist, I wanted to let our listeners know that you're actually Australian. We're very sorry to see what's happening to your home country. You were there recently for the holidays. Tell us what you experienced when you went there.
Yeah, it's pretty heartbreaking. I went back for the holiday break to visit my family in Canberra, the capital of Australia. And for the whole 2.5 weeks I was there, we couldn't see the sun because the smoke was so thick. And at one point we couldn't see across the road, and Canberra was the most polluted major city in the world as well, which is quite unusual.
And so how is that impacting residents? Are they trying to avoid being outside? And I mean, obviously that smoke can't be a good thing to breathe in.
Yeah, it's really bad for health, so people were tending to stay inside. We didn't go outside very much at all. If we did go outside, we had to wear the P95 respirators to protect our lungs from breathing in the smoke. And we really tried to stay inside for the whole holiday we were home during the Australian summer, yeah.
From news reports, it seems most of the fires are in the southeastern part of Australia. But in terms of the magnitude of the fires, the fact they've been burning for so long, is this impacting much of the country in terms of the smoke?
So a lot of the population live on the eastern coast of Australia. So Sydney and Melbourne are two of the most populated locations in Australia, 5 million people each, and around 5 million people each. And so these places are being impacted by the smoke that gets transported from these fires.
This time of year is also considered a fire season in Australia. And how is this season shaping up to be much different from previous seasons, Rebecca?
So this season started a little bit earlier than we usually have. Usually we have the fires more like now, early in the year. But these fires started all the way back in October last year. And what we're seeing from the emissions from the East Coast from this fire are larger than we've seen in the last 20 years. So it's definitely a large fire season.
In terms of when we think about the role of climate change, can you talk about, typical Australia has seasons of drought, but how is climate change making it worse, Rebecca?
Right. So there's a couple of ways that climate impact fires. So there's climate variability, and that is associated with these climate modes such as the El Niño Southern Oscillation. And the El Niño Southern Oscillation has to do with temperatures in the Pacific Ocean. And how those temperatures are working in the Pacific Ocean is they drive moisture either towards Australia or away from Australia. When we have an El Niño, we have really dry, hot conditions in Australia, so the moisture is driven away from Australia in an El Niño. And what we're seeing with climate change is there's been some research that suggests we're going to be sitting in more El Niños in the future, and that means more dry and hot conditions in terms of this climate variability that's driving, the droughts and wet seasons of Australia. And then in general, just climate change will create hotter, drier conditions.
Is this something that scientists have projected would happen to Australia at some point, but has the outcome sped up?
I think, like I was saying, there is this natural variability in the system as well, and I think we're seeing there's this underlying increase in temperatures and dryness and heat, and this is the variability on top of that underlying increase. So the variability could be driving it even hotter and drier than we would see with that underlying increase.
Again, I'm speaking with Rebecca Buchholz, project scientist with the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, as we talk about these fires that have been raging in Australia for a few months now. On the ground, we heard reports that with rain that did fall a week or so ago, that some of these mega fires have been extinguished. But are there other areas where these fires are still raging?
There is still some fires going on in Australia. We probably won't see all of the fires put out until later in the season.
And as we talk about climate change, when we think about these fires burning for so long, they're also releasing carbon dioxide. What do scientists know in terms of the amount of carbon that's been released because of these fires and how that contributes to climate, Rebecca?
Right, yeah. So fires can really have the potential to amplify climate change. And it's through these emissions is one way that they could amplify that climate change. It's all around, it all comes down to like the balance between burning and growing. So the fires emit smoke, and in that smoke it has particles and the carbon that you mentioned. And the carbon, if that's out of balance with the growing, if more carbon stays in the atmosphere than is taken out of the atmosphere from growing season, then that carbon will contribute to amplifying the climate change.
We've seen reports that we're looking at 25 million acres that have been burning. Any idea how long, when we think about the forests being able to revitalize themselves, to be able to be restored, and how that can really exacerbate what's happening there?
Right. It can take years to decades to restore forests, and it depends on a lot of things, in particular some of the precipitation and moisture that we'll be getting, and so things like the climate variability bringing that moisture to Australia will be important in regrowing these forests.
I'm sure you're aware there have been some discussions, especially in right-wing media, that says it's arson that's making these fires worse, not climate change. And how do you, as a scientist, respond to those claims?
Yeah, this is something interesting. When I came back to the US from my holiday, everybody was asking me, we've heard that it's been arsonists, and what's that about? And I was quite surprised because lightning definitely plays a role in starting these fires. And in some ways, it doesn't matter how the fires started. They got so big because of the underlying dry and hot conditions that we had.
We hear that, again, it is fire season, but it's usually peaking around this time. And so it doesn't sound like the danger has really passed for the country in terms of how we think about these droughts that continue in Australia. I mean, this could be a pattern that continues for future years?
For sure. We definitely have regular fires in Australia, and this kind of a pattern, research has shown that or has predicted that in the future climate change will produce more fires. And so this is something that we might see in the future. So it's really important to study how we might be changing the natural fire system. Yeah.
There's obviously a debate about climate change in this country. As a scientist, what are some ways to continue to talk about this so that people understand the many factors that are contributing to these natural disasters that are happening?
I think what's really important in terms of the conversation around climate change is people start talking to their neighbours about it. We're talking, the scientists are communicating what we know about climate change, but general people talking about climate change and what they know, and just having conversations about climate change can really help the movement forward.
What has been the recognition in Australia when climate change is discussed? How does it compare or contrast to the debates you hear here, Rebecca?
When I was back in Australia, there was definitely this particular fire event has really brought climate change to the forefront of people's minds in Australia, and I definitely saw a swelling of movement in the general public, all over social media, and just people that I would talk to when I was at the shops, and that was really encouraging.
So, just generally, when we think about climate change, it's making these wildfires that have happened in the past larger and more frequent, because not only are we looking at the dryness caused by these multiple-year droughts, but also the typical fire weather that Australia sees. Is that all correct?
That sounds great, yes.
Well, Rebecca, we appreciate speaking with you. We are happy to speak with you to understand, again, how scientists are looking at climate change, and as we look at these severe events happening around the globe. In this country, we think of the fire season in California, and how, again, you mentioned El Nino in the impacting Australia. That's also something that can impact us here as well.
Yeah, El Nino is something that is a huge variability system in the Earth system, and it can definitely impact regions far away from the Pacific Ocean, but also North America, South America. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank Rebecca Buchholz for joining us, again, project scientist with the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. Rebecca, thanks again.
Thanks for having me on the show.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, you've seen the headlines. Estimates that up to 1 billion animals have perished in the Australian fires. But what will be the long-term impact of species and habitat loss in Australia? We talk about that after the break. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. The Australian wildfires have impacted many people who have lost their homes. To date, there have been 25 deaths. The environmental toll is particularly sobering. More than 25 million acres have burned, leading to estimates that hundreds of millions of animals have died. What will this mean for many species unique to Australia? Joining us now via phone is Walter Yetz, professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at Yale University and director of the Yale Center for Biodiversity Movement and Global Change. Walter, welcome to Where We Live.
Good morning. Hello.
So tell us, when we think about your colleagues who are based in Australia, what are you hearing from them in terms of, again, this impact on many species in Australia?
Yeah, it's disturbing news, and thanks to an earlier sabbatical, I have a number of close colleagues over in Australia and the southern Australia that's been most affected, and they've been sharing quite some sobering news with me, as well as the news that we've all heard through the media. You mentioned earlier that estimate of 1 billion animals affected, and the issue is even larger than that, in that, yes, there are these individuals dying, which is really sad, but many more may get wiped out in the future from these consequences. And what's particularly disturbing is that there are a number of habitats, ecosystems, species that are really restricted to that very corner of the world, don't occur anywhere else, and we're really, really worried about their fate.
So let's talk about these unique animals that are found nowhere else but Australia. Many of us think of koalas and kangaroos, but tell us more of some of these other species that you mentioned that are facing big loss.
Yeah, so the koalas have made the headlines, and many of you may have seen those images that are really sort of heart-wrenching, seeing the koalas taken away from these fires burning behind them. But there is a whole vast biodiversity in this very region. Koalas will be and are very much impacted by this, but other species will be much, much more so. So there's a whole suite of animals called the marsupials that are largely restricted to Australia. You find some of the members of that group also in South America and up here in the US even, but the core has evolved there and is diversified there, and these are mammals, very charismatic mammals. We know the kangaroos, but there are many others that are more rodent-like, that are subterranean. There are bandicoots. There are a whole suite of species that may be much, much more affected than the koalas we may have seen in the headlines. There are frogs. There is a whole set of bird species, such as a really, really beautiful bird called the glossy black cockatoo, and a whole suite of other smaller species that have very restricted ranges. So they may be restricted to just a few forests in that part of Australia. And we now need to worry about their fate and whether future generations of humans will ever be able to see them again in the wild.
You mentioned, Walter, that the images are heartbreaking, and we tend to focus on the number that have potentially died or the severe burns. But let's talk more about this long-term impact of these fires. As you mentioned, the animals, we think about habitat loss, the 25 million acres that have burned. So of the animals that have been able to flee or survive as they return, what are the factors that are stacked against them?
Exactly. That's the worry, right? That while animals may have been able to stick it out, perhaps bury underground or run away, fly away, they'll come back now to an immensely altered situation where they will not have the same food supplies that they were used to. They may be missing some of their other interactors that they depend on in some other form, and many of those animals that may have survived may in fact be ghosts. They'll be gone ultimately. They're not representatives of the species anymore, in that they're very unlikely to be able to breed or reproduce, and it's a real worry, and it's one that we can't quite estimate yet, right? And many of the extinctions, local population losses, and species extinctions may only arise over the next years, over the next tens of years, potentially. You now have introduced species, dogs and rats and others potentially taking over, invasives that are called, taking over some of these places, and it may be impossible for the natural habitats and the natural food webs to ever come back in the original form. So a lot of members of this intricate network may not have a place anymore in the future.
I'm talking with Walter Goetz, Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Yale University, also Director of the Yale Center for Biodiversity Movement and Global Change. As we consider the impact of these, again, megafires in Australia, the impact on habitat and species lost there. Also, when we think about these animals that have perished or how their food webs have been changed, how that may impact humans in Australia as well in terms of agriculture, Walter.
Absolutely. So it's this food web getting disturbed, impacted, many vital nodes getting lost, will have repercussions that go beyond the very places that burned, that will affect neighboring locations and will ultimately affect human well-being in the region. Scientists are talking about literally trillions of losses among the invertebrates. There are some enigmatic, beautiful species, such as a species called the Richmond birdwing butterfly, beautiful species of butterfly. There are spiders called the peacock spiders that are equally just amazing creatures, and been called the jewels of the arachnid world, of the jewels among the spiders worldwide. So this issue of extinctions and potentially global extinctions goes way beyond mammals and birds. And many of these species, especially the invertebrates, and we've all seen the headlines about loss of bees and loss of insects, and the repercussions of that for agriculture, for our economies. There will be impacts felt down the road. There will be a whole new strategies required in the agriculture, in the way that those places get used because of that altered situation, that altered ecological situation of the surroundings. So there's a lot to unpack, a lot of research to be done, a lot to be understood still, but it's without doubt that the long-term costs, not just ecological but also economic, will be vast.
You mentioned that there's still a lot that needs to be understood, and scientists are working to do that. But when we look at events in the last 100 years or more, is there any kind of event that scientists can look back to as they consider what's happening to Australia today?
This was the hottest year on record, or this period of drought was the worst since the record started in Australia. There isn't actually a directly comparable situation. However, this type of disaster we've seen in other places before, actually close to home in the U.S., in California, right? The wildfires that happened there have some of the same potential causes, and have similar types of impact here, obviously not magnified by the high human population density in many of the parts of California where these fires happen. But this issue of these Mediterranean type or drier forest habitats getting now hit by these more extreme weather events, these droughts, is an issue that we have been seeing in other places before, and the chaparral habitat in particular in California has for decades been studied in that regard, and there is accumulating knowledge. But let me say this: there is one thing that's appreciated, that the changes to the natural fire regimes are that have come about to human uses of the landscapes have certainly magnified the issues that we're seeing today. And there is something that may be possible to do about that through smart local fire management. We can talk a little more about that. But this other issue of just these extreme events driving these large fires is just something that is now going to happen more and more through the changing climate worldwide.
You're talking earlier about how humans are encroaching onto ecosystems, not just thinking about the severe weather events that are driving or impacting biodiversity loss.
Yeah, and that's obviously magnifying the ecological problem or issue that's arising from these fires, and as well as the economic consequences. So, especially in California, but also in parts of Australia where these fires happened, the ecosystems have already been fragmented in major ways through all sorts of uses: urbanization, agriculture, commercial forestry, and it's that fragmentation that now means some of the patches that got wiped out through the fires cause even larger distances for animals to be able to escape the fires or be able to make it back to what could be suitable habitats for them. And but it's also the case that these nearby human uses have been altering the natural dynamics of these forests, and it's really important for us to understand that wildfires, are a natural part of these ecosystems. In fact, and some of them are defined by every now having a fire going through, and many of the plant species are well adapted to that. Mm-hmm. Many eucalypt species, for example, the way the barks work, and many of the other plants are used to wildfires coming through. However, they are used to different types of fires. They're used to fires that in the past used to be smaller in scale, didn't go quite so hot and large, and the seeds as well as the plants themselves could deal with those smaller fires, those smaller scale fires. But these new types of fires where you have vast landscapes burning and temperatures developing that are completely new to these ecosystems, that's the really troubling part, and that will be the tricky one to address going forward.
Walter, we only have a couple of minutes left, but I did want to ask, when we think about Australia as an island, again, certain species that are found nowhere else but Australia, in this country when certain animals have been locally extinct, thinking about wolves in Yellowstone, brought from Canada, is that something that can happen, that can help Australia, certain species, or because they're so unique, if they perish, there's no way of bringing them back?
We wish, and we look at these images, right, where seeing koalas carried away and into safety, and then you think, well, somebody will bring them back again when the habitat looks fine some years down the road. So it's heartening to think about that potential, and for a few select species that may work. And however, for many others, it's economically, it's practically completely impossible. First of all, because of the cost of these translocations, because of the impact, because many of the other parts of the food web have changed, right, through these fires, through these impacts. So you can't just bring something back and expect it will work like it did before. And most troublingly, some of these species will just be, there won't be any holdouts. There are several species of plants, several species of animals where about 70% of their habitat and up to 100% of the presumed populations global populations have been impacted or expected to be impacted over the next months through this change. So essentially, we'll be looking at a number of species that will, what we say, be ecologically extinct. There may still be a few around, but ultimately they may be beyond recovery, and that's the most troubling and worrying prospect here. That there may some of these species, whether it be these enigmatic butterflies, this jewel of a spider, or indeed some of these immensely charismatic bandicoots or potoroos or owls and so on will just not be around for future generations of humans, and this really nails the issue of climate change and its impacts on humanity.
Walter, again, we just have a little bit of time, but listeners may be feeling helpless hearing this conversation. Is there anything that Americans can do to help with the research that needs to be done as Australia tries to recover?
Yeah, I would. I don't have any very direct recommendations regarding conservation organizations. However, you know the international ones. I know the World WWF is very active in the region, as well as other conservation organizations. And I think some of the media that's been going around has been sharing some of the places where one could potentially donate and help in some of the recovery efforts.
That's Walter Yetz, professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at Yale University and director of the Yale Center for Biodiversity and Global Change. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show was produced by Carmen Baskoff. This week, we're bringing you a Where We Live Extra, produced by Carmen. She talks with a researcher about one of nature's weirdest animals that live right here in Connecticut. Check it out in Where We Live's podcast feed.